This is the 5 After 40 podcast, episode number 14.
Don't waste time judging yourself. Don't waste time being hard on yourself. Just recognize where you're at now and do your best moving forward.
And if you want to catch up to the people who have been doing this since they're 20, you need to be doing considerably more because you have less time for that money to grow.
This is the 5 After 40 podcast, a show where I dive into the FIRE movement to see what financial independence is all about. I'll share the steps I've taken to start my journey toward becoming financially independent, and along the way I'll bring in others who are on a path of their own. You'll hear stories and advice from people who have reached their version of FI, and from those like me who are still finding their way. This is a show for anyone who wants to learn, grow, and connect with others. This is 5 After 40. Hey, what's up, everyone? This is Ben, and you're listening to the 5 After 40 podcast, episode number 14. Today's show is a little different than ones I've had in the past. I have two guests on the show today. I have Maggie and Mike from the Friends on Fire podcast, which is one of my favorite shows. I definitely tune in as often as I can, and we dive into some really interesting topics today. It was great to have multiple people on to get different perspectives. They definitely have similar thoughts on a lot of things, but they do both bring a different perspective to these different topics. So it was really helpful to talk through some of this with both of them. They work in corporate America, and so we really dive into specifically how that impacts both financial independence journey and also how pursuing financial independence impacts their jobs as well. So we really get into that work-life balance and that whole concept. Maggie explains the concept of embracing the suck, so definitely stick around for that portion. We also talk through some of the intangible benefits of pursuing financial independence above and beyond just the financial part of it. And we even dive into the world of 80s movies with a little Back to the Future and Goonies talk. So I think you're really going to enjoy it. It's a great episode. Let's not waste any more time and jump over to the interview with Maggie and Mike. So today I have Maggie and Mike from the Friends on Fire podcast. Guys, thanks so much for coming on the show. How are you both doing?
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, we're doing great. Thanks for having us, Ben.
Yeah, excellent. So for listeners who aren't familiar with your backgrounds, maybe they haven't heard your show before, can you just give a little context as to how you developed an interest in personal finance and got involved with the FIRE movement?
Mike, I think you should go first because I can be so long-winded. I just want to try to inspire myself by you. So you go first. Men first on this one.
By my brevity.
Yeah.
So I think it's also appropriate that I go first because I've been part of the FIRE movement since I was a teenager. So my parents retired at 42, and it's always been part of my plan to retire early. I've always been frugal. I've always been good with money. I wrote a book about personal finance last year called Your New Relationship with Money. And it's always been a big part of my life. And then I met Maggie at work. We work for the same company, and we became friends over this. And we decided to do this podcast together.
Yeah, well, I'm super impressed with your brevity, Mike, because I was going to start, at the very beginning and go through my almost 40 years in existence. But I'm inspired by your brevity, so I'm going to give it a shot at being quick. So, very, very different start than Mike, but we've ended up in very similar places. So I would say, I from various influences in my life grew up fairly frugal and always had, a good appreciation for earning money. And as a result of having to earn so much of it myself at a young age, I was just very cautious with my money, and I was good at saving. And, my parents instilled in me saving money. And, I grew up in a very average middle class household, but we didn't have money for a lot of extra fancy things. So I had to, pay my own insurance when my parents, handed me down a car. I had to pay my own insurance, pay for my own gas. And so from a very young age, I had to get a job and I had to pay for things that I wanted. And so it instilled in me, a respect for how hard it could be to earn money. And then as a result, wanting to protect it. And even just as I started my life and my career and, having a real salary and paycheck, I was just always super frugal, and I never had a term for it or knew why until, a few years ago, I learned about the FIRE movement and was like, oh, that's why I'm doing this. I just hadn't sort of put the pieces together on why I was living the way I was living, if you will.
Yeah, frugality definitely is something I've seen. It kind of overlaps with people that are pursuing FI or the FIRE movement, but it's not like a requirement. So, Mike, do you feel like you're a frugal person, or do you feel like you have a different approach naturally than maybe Maggie does?
No, I think we're frugal in a lot of the same ways. I think I'm very disciplined about how I approach spending. And, I've been tracking my spending and tracking my net worth for decades now. And so I have kind of honed in on what I want to lean in a little bit heavier on spending. So travel is really important to me and my family. So we spend money on travel. But then other things we just, like electronic stuff and entertainment things, we know what makes us happy. It's not, I don't view it as penalizing myself or depriving myself on anything. I just know exactly what I need to spend to be happy.
Yeah, it's funny when you asked him that question, Ben, I was thinking there is a word that is stronger than frugal for Mike, and I don't know what it is because the word frugal doesn't do justice. And you said you're disciplined, Mike. Disciplined is one of the best words for you because you are sometimes I shouldn't even call myself frugal based on what I'll spend money on that you would never spend money on, Mike. Like I definitely splurge a lot more and have justifications for things. But what I've never let happen is lifestyle inflation, right? As I've made more money over the years, I pretty much live on probably less than I did when I was, 23 and coming out of college, or 22 and coming out of college.
Do you feel like that's a natural thing for you to do, or do you have to hold back to like avoid that lifestyle creep?
I mean, Mike, it's for sure natural for you. You just came out of the womb this way. I always joke, but I think it's pretty natural. I mean, I sort of find like pleasure in finding ways to save money or finding ways to do things myself. Like I like DIYing things. So I enjoy it. I don't find it to be I think it's natural and I enjoy it, which makes it natural. But yeah, I'd say yes. Was that a yes or no question? I forgot the question,
It was
Ben.
whatever you wanted to do with it. It was just getting a sense of like, because I know for me, I'm somebody who definitely is not frugal. That's just not part of my DNA. And I guess maybe I've kind of struggled with that idea of like, is it like a learned behavior or is it just something that's built into your DNA? And I kind of feel like it's built into your DNA, but maybe it's how you're raised and how your parents maybe set the example for you. So what do you guys think? Is that more of a learned behavior?
I think it's both. So if you are used to a certain inflated lifestyle, it is very painful to scale that back and become frugal. So if you've grown up frugal, it's a lot easier just to continue that momentum. But I think there's also a big element of what are you working towards? So, what is your why for financial independence? And if you have a strong why, it makes all these trade-offs very easy. And so, Maggie and I talk about this all the time. We don't see this as an inherently difficult part of life to make these trade-offs, to make these decisions. We see it as, oh, I'm saving $10 or 50 cents or whatever it is so that I can retire a little bit early or I can have a little bit larger of a cushion. So we see it as a great opportunity, not a pain point.
Yeah. I think also an interesting thing, like as we were just using the word frugal so much, I started to think like, what does frugal even mean? Because sometimes I'm like, I don't even actually know. Maybe I wouldn't define myself as frugal. Like I'm sitting here wearing a Lululemon tank top and a expensive pair of headphones, but I rarely buy things, right? Like I've not purchased clothing for myself in well over a year, and I maybe, I just don't. I'm more of a minimalist even maybe than a frugalist, right? Like I like high quality things, but I don't require a lot of things to be happy. And if I couldn't afford those things, I'd be okay with, what I mean? Like I wouldn't go into debt to have something that is a
Right.
higher quality, I guess is a way I'd say it. So I'm very like cautious with how I spend money.
Yeah, I think frugality, and yeah, there's probably different definitions of it, but the way I've had people explain it is more focused on value than it is on
Yeah,
just
it's a
the
great.
lowest price.
I think you're right, because we always talk about the difference between being frugal and being cheap. I
Right.
think value is a great word. It's a great point.
And I find both value and the lowest price.
So
Yeah.
it's like a double whammy.
Exactly.
I know Michael like orders something from eBay that takes like 2 months to get here, but he's like, but I got it for 99 cents. And I'm like, yeah, that's cool.
So how quickly did you guys recognize in each other working together that you had this common interest? What's the kind of backstory with you guys realizing that you had this common interest and saying, hey, let's maybe get together and do something with this podcast?
Oh, I mean, I locked eyes with Mike in the hallway one day and just could see it in his eyes, you know? I'm just kidding.
Well, it helps that I'm Maggie's finance partner at work. So my job is to like, give her shit about her
Our job is to talk
spending.
about money at work.
Yeah, our job is to talk about business expenses. And so and one of the things, working in finance professionally, everybody assumes that you are also like knowledgeable about investing and taxes, and that's not necessarily the case because finance as a profession is very broad. But I do happen to be very passionate about those things. So like Maggie, of course, was asking me questions about
I was asking for tax advice, wasn't I?
It was taxes and
I was like, you work in finance. You're here to help me with my taxes, right?
Right. And then you had a Roth 401k question. And then we kicked it off from there.
Yeah. And you didn't just like answer the question, right? You didn't just phone it in with like a yes or no or do this. You were like, you busted out like a spreadsheet and a deep analysis. And I was like, wow, he's serious, And it just continued our conversations. And then next thing I knew, I was tracking my expenses for you and you were commenting on my husband's cell phone bill. It was great.
So then you decided, hey, we should probably talk to other people about this on the internet. So let's start a podcast.
That's actually kind of what happened.
Yeah. So Maggie and I hit it off really well, and we wanted to do something together. We have very complementary skills. She's in marketing, I'm in finance. And so we wanted to do some extracurricular activity, whether it be some sort of business or passion project. And we had both been interested in podcasting for a while, and we're like, let's do this. We think we could be kind of good at this. And then we started it, and it's been fun, and we've been continued.
And the whole idea about friends talking about money. So that I agree that's something, and maybe you guys this has kind of led you to getting that topic as your focus. It isn't common for people to bring up money among their friends, or maybe it's different for you guys. Maybe you started it because you obviously are comfortable talking about it and maybe other people aren't. So what's the thinking behind trying to make it a more comfortable setting for people to talk about money within their circle of friends?
I think it's the second thing you said, Ben, of we were realizing it's not something we talk about with certainly, I don't know about you, Mike. It's not something I actively talk about with most of my other friends. And I started realizing the conversations that Mike and I were having, we were creating a much like deeper bond and friendship very quickly. Because we were like, when you start like reviewing someone's expenses and like talking about how you're saving for college or what you're doing or how you believe, like just your financial sort of beliefs and habits, it's a really quick way to get to know somebody and to really understand, just to really understand them. I actually heard a quote the other day. I was going to see if I could find it really quick, but
why don't you just butcher it?
Okay, here we go. This was the quote. I actually had just written it down. It said, show someone your budget and they'll see your values. And it was it was an author of the book, The Year or Less, that was being interviewed on Popcorn Finance. But I just thought it was a great quote because you learn, you get to know people and you have such more valuable and meaningful discussions when you actually talk about money with your friends. And I think Mike and I were realizing that about each other and about how our friendship formed and grew. And so when we were talking about the idea of having a podcast, it was just that sort of name. And we had been talking about like, friendship and money. And so it kind of just like clicked together. But we really do believe, and we've seen it with the podcast, that starting to talk about money creates these much more valuable and meaningful connections and important conversations with people you care about. I've had so many people, coworkers, friends that I've reconnected with, et cetera, who have heard about the podcast and then start, asking me some question, or like we'll have a really deep discussion about like something going on in their marriage or something going on at work. And I'm like, usually it's a lot of like, oh, what'd you do last weekend? How's the weather? Oh, how's this quarantine treating you? And the conversations aren't as meaningful and deep.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So yeah, I think people tend to stay kind of surface level with their conversations. It's just, yeah, like you said, how's the weather? How's it going? But yeah, your spending habits and how you've maybe budgeted or not budgeted it's like they're little like breadcrumbs that you've left behind you that are votes for what you find valuable in life. So
yeah,
it makes sense that, yeah, once you start digging into some of those things, it is kind of, I mean, I think people probably feel vulnerable when they're talking about what they've spent their money on.
yeah. And like, this is a kind of a specific example, but Ben, I've heard you talk on the podcast about the kayaks that you bought, and you had your like effort list, right? Of just
Mm-hmm.
kind of finally deciding to buy them. But like, just knowing that that's what you chose to effort on, that tells me something about you, right? The fact that kayaks was a priority. And that's a compliment, by the way. Like, I think it's a good thing to spend money on, right? It's like an outdoors thing. You go do it with your kids. It's like something that, keeps you fit. Like, there's so many great things about it. But that's a good example. That is a very different investment than, I don't know. I don't want to knock other things and make a judgment about them, but it tells you something about somebody, what they spend their money on.
So do you guys ever buy things that you have regrets about? Do you have that kind of buyer's guilt? Like, oh, wow, this doesn't fit into my plan, and now I feel like I'm a fraud, or maybe that's a little too harsh, but are there times when you have those experiences?
I don't.
Mike doesn't.
No, I don't. No, sometimes I do, but it's really just with little things. Like I overspent by $50 on some item. I put so much thought into how I spend my money that it hasn't come up in 10 years, honestly. But Maggie actually brought up something the other day that we had a very heated discussion about. Maggie, why don't you share what that purchase was?
Oh, this is highly personal. We can't talk about that. No, I'm just kidding. I'm considering buying a new car. We're not going to get it. It'll derail us on this discussion, Ben, but I was sort of am considering buying a new car. And we're going to do a whole episode called Maggie Wants to Buy a New Car, where Mike tries to tell me all the reasons why I shouldn't.
Like a new car?
Well, yeah, technically, yes, a new car, but yes.
Isn't that illegal in the fire community? Like,
that's what Mike said. Mike's wife was like, "Is she even still like on this path?" And I was like, "Yeah, I am." We'll get into it. There's a lot of rationale behind it. I got a lot of kids; they have nowhere to go, but anyways, it's a bigger discussion. But yeah, but what I actually love about this community and the idea of talking with friends about money is I want to be challenged on the idea of buying a new car. Like, I would rather I was trying to like put a term on this, but like, it is the opposite of peer pressure and keeping up with the Joneses to have, because I could see your like face. I mean, you were being nice, Ben, but you were like, there was some judgment there of like, why would you ever buy a new car? We did a whole episode and we were like, never buy a new car. But I actually love the idea of like being challenged about things and questioned about stuff, because I think it's the right way, right? The opposite would be me wanting to buy something to impress people and to like have people saying, oh, like, I don't want people in my life who are like, oh yeah, you should buy a fancy car so that you can look like, everybody else, or blah, blah, blah. And this isn't a fancy car I'm talking about. It does happen to be new because they have not been making it very long, but it's just the idea of, I actually like being challenged on these purchases. So I don't have a lot of purchases that I'd say I regret. I do have a very whimsical treehouse in my backyard. It was expensive, and I only regret it because my kids don't use it and they think it's haunted now. But I had dreams that they would play in it, and maybe they still will. I got another 10 years of them in the house. So, but that's probably one of my biggest, most recent regrets in the past few years.
Just to jump on the being disappointed in your kids comment.
Not using things.
I tried to have my kids watch Back to the Future recently, and it just didn't go over well. Like 20, 30 minutes, they're both looking at me going, this is weird.
How old are they?
My son just turned 10, and my daughter is 7. She'll be 8 in a couple months.
So it's the same age.
They're pretty young,
too.
but
we had our kids watch. My husband was like obsessed with getting them to watch this, but he really wanted them to watch Goonies. And I have 3 girls also.
Yeah.
And we watched Goonies, and it was a little slow going at first, but they loved it by the end of it. But the production quality, I think, is hard for kids to get behind. They're so used to the production quality of like new movies that I think they can tell how dated it is, and it's like hard for them. It's like me watching a black and white movie.
Yeah, the quality is definitely, you're right, it's not a Pixar movie, so
Yeah.
it's not like a bright neon
Yeah.
thing on an HD screen. It looks all
That's too bad
grainy and
you didn't like, Back to the Future. You should try Goonies with them. I don't know if they've seen it.
yeah. Well, we watched The Princess Bride last night, and they both enjoyed that, but it's because I read them the book, so I think that had
Okay.
something in it to do with it. So anyway, I digress. But I did want to actually jump back over. I know you guys mentioned a little bit about working together, and some of what you've talked about in the past is just that concept of kind of working in corporate America and how that overlaps with your personal finance goals. So can you give a little context as to how those two I guess, areas of your lives intersect with each other?
Sure. So I think the first thing to understand about corporate America is that the compensation structure, um, compared to the amount of like effort you put in, is really kind of an ideal working environment. The benefits that large companies and I guess medium sized and small companies provide, if you take advantage of them, can and take advantage of them early, set the stage for a very strong financial life. And then if you are doing those things and taking advantage of those opportunities, and at the same time working towards having a meaningful career that isn't overwhelming and stressful, so managing your career progression, finding roles that are good for you, you can find a really good balance. I think what you hear about in books and podcasts and interviews is just the extremes and people who are extremely burnt out and drop everything to go do something else. But in many cases, there's so much opportunity for balance if you are mindful about it and structuring your career progression to target those things, not to be the highest position in the company or earn as much money as you can. If you look for balance and you look for a good return on your on your savings, there's just so much you can do with corporate America.
Yeah, it's an interesting cycle when you really think about it. Because it's funny, Mike and I had not really like, we sort of will tangentially talk around some of these topics sometimes, but we haven't, like, prepped for this particular discussion, and so a lot of the things you just said, Mike, I completely agree with. But even as you were saying it, I was thinking, like, it's almost this, like, interesting cycle, and I think about it in my own career. One, you didn't say this as literally, but I think you meant it, Mike. You just make more money in corporate America. It pays really well, right? And so that helps you on your FIRE journey. So it's not always the highest paying job, but I've been paid incredibly well compared to many other careers and paths I could have gone down based on the fact that, my first job right out of college was with a Fortune 50 company. And it paid well, right? So I don't know a better way to say it. And and then from there, there's like annual increases, promotions. It was good to me, right? It's been good to me over the past 20 years. And then you end up on this interesting cycle of like, I did not have balance when I first started working. Luckily, I was younger. I didn't have kids. I wasn't necessarily seeking balance. I was working long hours. And so actually by hour, it probably didn't pay very well, but annually it paid nicely. So you can make a lot of money in corporate America. And if you use it well and don't get caught up in lifestyle inflation and like, we work with a lot of people who are spending a lot of money around us and we're not, you can really use it to your advantage to save well and to or save aggressively, not let your lifestyle get inflated, and then have a lot of money to then have the confidence and freedom to continue to kind of create that balance that Mike was talking about, right? So I feel like I have a lot more, I don't know a better word for it other than confidence to create boundaries and to have more flexibility and other things in my job because I leverage the money that I've made over the years to save it, to feel confident, to know that I have other options, if that makes sense.
Yeah, you end up with this kind of weird intersection of your work-life balance, and then you're overlapping that with your spending saving balance that's also part of your life, and so you've got this combination that might be kind of challenging to it's like you're balancing 2 balances. It's a weird intersection there. So, I mean, how do you guys feel like, when you look at the FIRE movement, there's this whole idea of it's a spectrum of save as much as possible, work as much as possible, like be really aggressive versus I think maybe Mike, what you were getting at earlier is finding some more valuable things that bring value to your life that you actually do spend your money on.
When you find yourself in a position in corporate America where you have, a reasonable amount of stress, but you're not overwhelmed, you're busy, but you're not working weekends, and you have the financial flexibility and cushion that Maggie was talking about, it allows you to do a couple things. One, you're not as stressed out with constant changes and risks of layoffs and that sort of
Yeah.
stuff. And then the other is you have the financial means and the free time to go pursue your passions. And so this podcast that Maggie and I do is a perfect example of that. We have both pretty demanding jobs, but we have enough time to go record these episodes all the time and work on it in all of our free time. And that's really meaningful. And so as it relates to, fire, if you can use the time working when you're earning a lot and saving a lot and start to develop what your passions are and what you would do with the rest of your life, that's pretty cool. The thing that is a little too risky for me is to drop it all and pursue something new that you haven't tried out yet. But if you've spent 5 or 10 years of your working life pursuing a passion, doing a side hustle that you really love, and you know that you can continue it for another 2 or 3 decades, that's a really cool opportunity of working in corporate America.
I used to think it had to be an all or nothing approach, right? Like you're all on, you're all in. And similar to what Mike was just talking about, I've gotten a lot of joy out of starting this podcast and starting to realize like I don't have to wait until I quit my job to start to pursue things that I'm interested and get into some just different passion projects and things like that. And I also personally I've got a lot of issues with like setting boundaries and saying no, and Mike's really good at it. And even just being more disciplined. And I really have gotten a lot from Jess at the Pioneers. Well, Jess and Corey at the Pioneers, who I know you've interviewed.
Yep.
And their mentality around, the journey being as good as the destination or as important as the destination. Because I do think, particularly in the types of jobs we're in, you can start to get into a mentality of like, I've got to slog away at this and, just like not have any balance and like push through to some, magical date or point. And I've really been trying to, over the past year a little bit since I've had kids, honestly, but more so over the past year as I've understood the concept of FI more, tried to find ways to leverage the financial flexibility and freedom I have built for myself into more confidence and boundaries at work, if that makes sense, so that I can still have my job. I can still take pride in doing a good job, but I can set boundaries and limits and say, you know what, I'm going to do the best I can do with the time I have available to me. And I'm not going to do some of the things that I used to do many, many years ago, which was work every single night and weekend and just give way too much of myself. And I had like so little left at the end of any day or any week.
Yeah, and maybe this is kind of part of what you're getting at, but it's kind of obvious how your work and your income is going to impact your financial position. But how have you guys seen your financial position impact your work? The work you've done in saving and developing those good habits and kind of growing in that area, has that translated back into improved performance or more confidence with your jobs?
Yeah, definitely. So there's really two pieces of this. If you are earning and saving and growing your net worth, on the kind of short term career decision front, it makes things a lot easier for you because, I've worked with so many people who will kill themselves to get a little bit higher level of a bonus, or will work very hard to go get a different type of role in the hopes that it gets them promoted a year earlier because they need that 10 or 20% raise so bad. And if you're not focused on these short-term increases in your compensation, it allows you to focus on stuff that you're really happy with. And in the way that I always look at these things is that, like, yeah, I could go find a promotion and maybe I'd make X number of dollars, but divided by the number of hours I'd be putting in over the years and how much more stressful or challenging it would be. That's not a good return on investment. But then the other part of this is what happens when you're in, a mass layoff situation like we're going through right now all across the world and in our company as well. There's furloughs, there's layoffs. We are not nearly as stressed out about this as other people are. In fact, Maggie and I were talking about when they've made big changes at our company, people were very upset, and we'd call each other and we'd be like, this doesn't really bother me too much. Is something wrong with me? And it's not, we have so much of a cushion and so much flexibility that it allows us to kind of move past some of these things that maybe 10 or 15 years ago for us would have been very challenging.
And I think the second part to that, Mike, too, on that specific example is we also have learned over the years through maturity and also just our own kind of hobbies and interests and passions that our job doesn't define us, right? So I know a time in my life where my identity was so caught up in my job and my worth, my worth and my identity were so caught up in what my job was that I would think, oh my gosh, like, who am I without this job? I no longer think that way anymore, right? Like, I know who I am. I know a million things I would spend time on if I was no longer working. And Ben, the other thing, there's two things that come to mind for me. One, and I've told Mike this story, I'll be brief on it, but there was a day that I was at an offsite work event, and I was kind of like off talking to somebody that I didn't know really well. And she was asking me a bit of a sort of like mentor question. Like, she was like, how are you the way you are at work? And like, you're so like, you're yourself and you're so confident and you're so like just casual about many things. And she's like, how are you like this? She was kind of saying, I want to be more like that. How are you like that? And in my true fashion, where like, I have no brevity about me and I'm just very long-winded, I kind of went off on this like tangent with her. And what's funny is the tangent that I went off on was talking about financial independence and how I live my life financially. And I kind of was like, had to stop myself like halfway down this rant about it and was like, why am I talking about that? And I was reconnecting the dots with her, and I was like, look, one of the reasons I immediately go to talking about money is because that is what has given me the confidence to be myself at work. And to be clear, it's not because I'm like sitting on some big cushion of money. It's not about the money. It's about the fact that I have financial freedom and options. And so I'm not afraid of things. I'm not operating from a place of fear. I have a great sense of confidence that I'm willing, and some of it's maturity too, right? And just time, but like, I'm willing to be myself at work. I'm willing to infuse what I believe in into the way that I lead my team at work and the way that I act and the way that I work with other people. And I'm not coming from a place of fear. And I'll give you a really good, like, tactical example. We work in a really complex global company that it has like every single aspect of complexity. It's like we operate in tons of different languages. It's a franchise business. We've got offices all around the world. It's super complex. There's a lot of bureaucracy. There's a lot of politics. And I don't know what you mean politics in a bad way, but there's a lot of different constituents and things you've got to kind of deal with and account for. And there's often, back when we were physically in the office, like once a week, I was in a discussion where somebody is sort of like posturing to get more accountability or responsibility, or to what is the word, like land grab, right? Like they want more of something. They're fighting for something for kind of the wrong reasons, right? Because they're trying to get more accountability within their team or something else. And I think for, a long time, even before I was what I would call financially independent, my attitude was always like, what makes the most sense, right? What's best for the company? What is just the most logical to do? Not what's best for me. Like, I'm not trying to like land grab and have more accountability within my team. I think that is a very specific example to show how having more confidence and understanding that you have a lot of options in life and you could, kind of leave this tomorrow and be okay, changes the way you interact with people at work, right? Like, I joke half the time. I'm like, you can have that if you want it, right? Like, I'm not, I'm not trying to like fight for something for the wrong reasons, right? Like I really genuinely do. We have this term like enterprise mindset. I genuinely have an enterprise mindset. And it's sort of because that's how I am. But another reason is because, I'm not afraid of losing my job. I'll put it that way. Right. And to operate from a place of managing your career or yourself from a place of fear is not a healthy, like a productive, good things don't come from that day to day.
Yeah, it's almost this concept of like being in debt or having financial stress. It just takes up space in your life, right? It's just like,
yeah.
it just fills that bucket that, when you can remove that, all of a sudden you've got additional space for hopefully better things, more
Yeah, that's a
confidence
great
or,
point.
yeah, or more intentional kind of choices and things in your life. And that can trickle obviously into your work, but also in the rest of your life when you don't have so much real estate taken up by these negative financial stresses. It just frees you, I think, and this is the point you're getting to, is it frees you to feel better about what you're doing both at work and in the rest of your life.
Yeah, that's a great way of saying it, Ben.
That's a great short way of saying
I know it is. Yeah.
I need to have more of an enterprise mindset so I can really get on board with the enterprise answers along.
Yeah, I basically get paid to make something that really could be said in 30 seconds turn into like a 5-minute, statement. So,
but I think this is interesting to talk through. There's the obvious tangible benefits of being financially stable and pursuing FI, but there's a lot of these intangible things that maybe people don't focus on quite as much when they're trying to decide, hey, should I cut back on my budget or should I try to save more, or these different things, these like action steps that you need to take. If you're just focused on that end goal that seems so far away, that's harder to kind of motivate yourself with than just understanding like, no, this is actually going to improve your life day to day in the meantime.
Yeah.
So I've heard you talk about embracing the suck, and I'm not sure exactly what that means. Can you jump into kind of what the thinking is behind that phrase?
yeah, so I heard that term for the first time a couple years ago at a course that our company, a company brought in a third party called Tignum. They didn't come up with the phrase. They just have a bunch of former military people who reference the phrase. And it wasn't even a core part of what they were talking about. It was sort of like a side point this guy made. And I really latched onto it. And I was like, tell me about that. Like, what does that mean? And he kind of told the story. It comes from like Navy SEAL training. But it's the idea of consciously accepting or appreciating something that could be extremely unpleasant or but unavoidable, right? So it's just the idea of saying like, look, there's certain things, like there's things about my job and anyone's job day to day that kind of suck. You're like, I don't like doing this part of it. Like I like this part, I don't like this part. This is annoying, this sucks. And the concept that these Navy SEALs kind of came up was with like, you gotta like, it's about your mindset and your perspective, right? You gotta like embrace it. You gotta recognize, like I think about it when I think about our job sometimes, and when there's things that I don't like doing, one of the ways that I embrace the suck is I remind myself like, this is literally what I'm getting paid to do, right? Like I am in a leadership position. I am paid more as a result. I am paid to deal with the hard stuff, right? And so for me to like complain about that or be annoyed or frustrated or whatever, like is not helpful, right? And a little bit of that is like a mindset shift. And again, sort of setting your expectations appropriately. But the idea of embracing the suck is realizing, and I love how it kind of ties to FI too, because to finish the Navy SEAL reference, they're in Navy SEAL training and they're going through this like terrible thing where they're like wet and cold and they have not been allowed to sleep and they're like covered in sand and their whole body's chafing and they're hungry and just all these things. But they know eventually they will get fed. They know eventually they will be allowed to sleep. They know eventually they will get into dry, warm clothing. And so they were like, we're doing this for a reason. We're doing this for a greater cause, which is to get through training and to become a Navy SEAL. And we know it's going to suck, and I'm going to embrace it, and I'm going to kind of realize it. And again, it's like to consciously accept it. And so I just, that's what it is. And I love the term. And I think it has a lot of tie-ins to corporate America because there's a lot of things that sometimes suck. I honestly say not any more than any job probably though. And then there's a lot of things that tie into FI because it is the idea of, there's some things that might be harder to get through, but you're doing it because there's something good on the other side.
Yeah, that's something that it's good perspective to have for sure. I mean, I've had the same kind of thoughts in my head in the past as I've moved into different leadership roles and recognizing when people, people just tend to complain and whine about their job, really regardless of how much they're getting paid. It's just what people tend to do.
Yes. True.
So I think that's been something that's helped me get through those tougher times when I'm frustrated with things, is understanding like this is exactly what I'm supposed to be handling, and that's why I'm in this role.
Yeah, that's a great point.
So Maggie, I've heard a rumor that you're either about to hit or you have hit kind of a milestone birthday this year.
I'm about to. I'm a few months away.
Few months away. Okay, so I'm just curious because me having gone through this, a couple of years ago, have you thought about kind of transitioning through those different decades of your life and getting to 40 and kind of getting over that? It's kind of an arbitrary benchmark, but I think people naturally segment things in their life. So
yeah,
what's your perspective on kind of getting to that decade and how that may be different for you than maybe the previous one?
Yeah, it's funny. I am a person who can tend to kind of like segment things. And so to me, it's not like a stressful number in any way, but it is a meaningful number. And so, maybe a year ago, actually when I turned 39, I remember like making some lists and consciously thinking about like some things I'd like to accomplish in my sort of final year of my 30s. I don't think I've done any of them. In fairness, I had many goals and expectations for the year of 2020, as many people did. And then a global pandemic hit in in March. And for our company it hit even, I mean, we have a lot of operations in China, and so like we had been dealing with this for the entire year, really, well before it really kind of hit the world more broadly. But I had a lot of goals and plans this year. I had some like fun trips planned because a lot of me and my best friends are all like childhood friends are all turning 40 this year, which we had to cancel. So I had a lot of like fun travel planned this year to celebrate it. And yeah, I had some goals. Honestly, most of my big goals, like I wanted to pay off my mortgage before I was 40, but I ended up doing it over a year ago, or maybe a year and a half ago, or I don't know what, but I did it early. And so I had some other kind of by the time I'm 40 goals, but I'm feeling like pretty good about where I am turning 40. I mean, a lot of the things that are important to me are just how I'm living my life financially. And I've made, actually, I'd say like significant progress on that since I met Mike. So, and I probably met you about the time when did we meet, Mike? Do you know the exact day?
Just kidding. I do know the exact day.
But what year? Like,
November 6th, 2018.
Are you being serious that you know the oh, because you interviewed. That's why.
Yeah, I interviewed the day before my birthday.
For this job. Yeah.
That's right.
I thought you were going to go with a Back to the Future reference and say
that would have been good.
November 5th, 1955, but
that's funny. You clearly have watched Back to the Future recently.
Yeah, I've watched it a lot.
You're like, I know that date anytime. But yeah, I forgot what I was talking about. Oh, the day. So yeah, when I met Mike, I definitely would say I further catapulted the journey I was on in terms of like spending even less, right? Like we were pretty good before, and we had been on this journey that we didn't exactly have a name for. But I got even better after meeting Mike. And again, some of it is like what we were talking about earlier of like, I had a better influence in my life that further challenged me. Like I thought I had done everything I could do. I thought I had removed all the expenses I could. And then like I met Mike and removed even more. And then the other thing is like a lot of the other things that are important to me are just like staying physically fit and healthy and eating healthy and things like that. And I've continued on that journey, and like, I have not taken any back steps there. And so I had a lot of goals of like just wanting to be at my peak of healthiness when I turn 40. And the quarantines actually helped for that because I'm pretty good about working out consistently anyways, but I've been walking a ridiculous amount that I was not able to before, just because we are home so much. And so that's one thing I've really enjoyed. But yeah, the year of 2020 has kind of put it's changed, I guess, some of the goals I had and some of my approaches for things I wanted to focus on this year.
But Maggie is embracing the suck of 2020.
I'm embracing the suck of 2020.
That's right.
Because there's actually a lot of amazing things that are coming from working remote, and there's tons of pieces I've really enjoyed about being remote, honestly.
Yeah, I mean, for me, that's I probably wouldn't have even started this podcast if it
Yeah,
hadn't been for this, right? Like this is opened up. I just don't have a commute. There's just you're kind of you're always home. So I just had these little pockets in my day that made sense and opened up some opportunities and said I gotta fill that with something positive other than just watching Netflix.
Yeah.
Great.
So Mike, what about you? Do you feel like your priorities have evolved as you've gotten older?
They have changed since I had kids, I think it changes for everybody. But my kids are still pretty young, a little bit younger than Maggie's, and I'm a few years away from 40. But you know, going back to kind of my intro story about financial independence, I've been working on this for a really long time, and I've had very clear goals and processes laid out. And so I think things have actually, once I started going up in corporate America and earning more money and taking advantage of benefits to a greater degree, things started to accelerate for me. So I'm a little bit ahead of where I thought I would be, but that just means that I'm going to do all of these things that I was going to do originally a little bit faster. And so I think the only thing that's really changed is really taking advantage of the flexibility that my career has provided to go pursue these other projects. The big one being doing this podcast.
So as we kind of wrap things up, I guess that's a good transition into as both of you think about people who might be coming at this from a different angle, meaning that they haven't had their lives leading up to this path, but they're starting to turn that corner maybe later in life. What advice do you have for people that maybe it's a little overwhelming? I think, Mike, you kind of alluded to this earlier, like it's hard to all of a sudden pivot when you've got these life habits. But what is some maybe general first steps that you guys have as advice for people who are just starting to really get their finances together later in life?
Okay, I got a lot of thoughts on this one. I'll be quick though. This will be quick. I'll be quick.
All right.
Okay. I think that's a great question, first off, Ben. And I love the whole concept of FI after 40, because I really think it opens up a conversation of people realizing like it's never too late, right? 40 is not even that old. I'm telling myself that since I'm about to turn 40. But it's never too late, right? And there's I think so much that can come from the sort of story you're telling. But to answer your question, I think it's the same concepts. Like it's the exact same concepts. You're just doing them later in life at a later point. There's absolutely nothing you can do to undo the past. For the most part, I'm going to come back to that in a second. You should not, and on my point of like, you can't undo the past, like don't waste time judging yourself. Don't waste time being hard on yourself. Just recognize where you're at now and do your best moving forward. And on my point about you can't undo the past, you can undo a few things from the past, right? You can downsize your home. You could downsize your car, right? If you have a really expensive car that you can't afford, you can sell that car and you can get a cheaper car. You can start spending less and saving now, but there are a couple things you can do to undo the past. You can sell a lot of things, right? If you own a bunch of stuff you don't need, or you have, expensive hobbies, that stuff you don't use anymore. So those are some of the things you can do to kind of quote undo the past. But for the most part, like don't dwell on the past. Just do your best with what you've got now. And, once you know better, do better.
And I think for people who are a little bit later in life and later in their career, it's important to both have a very strong vision for what you're hoping to achieve so that you have the motivation. But then try your best not to slowly ease your way into these things. Like when you are just starting in the workforce and you're 22, it might be a real challenge to save $2,000 a year for your retirement. But if you are 40 or 50, don't save $2,000 a year. Save $20,000 a year, save $50,000 a year. You likely have the means to do so if you make some tougher decisions. But what I see a lot of people doing who, when they finally learn about some of the corporate benefits, how 401ks work, how deferred income programs work, how stock purchase plans work, they like to ease their way into it because it isn't comfortable for them. But that is not what you should be doing if you have an aggressive timeline. You need to make a tough decision and you need to jump in big, because hopefully at that point you are earning enough to do that. And if you want to catch up to the people who have been doing this since they're 20, you need to be doing considerably more because you have less time for that money to grow.
Is this like when you convinced me to max out my DCP this year, Mike?
Yeah.
I wanted to just try a slightly bigger percentage, but we have a deferred compensation program, which is, again, one of the many benefits that you can get at some larger companies. And Mike convinced me to go all in to the max, which is 75% of my salary. So I have a very small paycheck right now. But it's a great example of all in. Like you force yourself to live on very little, like it's possible.
Yeah. And I showed you what the return on investment was going to be, how that program works. And you're going to make a considerable amount of money on it because you went big. You had the discipline and the means to do it.
Yep.
Yeah, making those adjustments. I think I look back to like when all of a sudden I had to pay childcare for 2 kids, and I'm thinking, how am I going to find the money to do this? And like you figure it out, and it's almost the same thing. Like you just have to make those changes, and then you'll adjust to it. Like there's all kinds of little spots in your budget that will open up if you make some sacrifices. And guess what? You're probably not going to starve. You're not going to die from not having 400 cable channels. You're going to adjust positively by making those adjustments.
Yeah, and you're gonna, like you said, adjust positively. You're probably gonna realize you're just as happy, if not more happy now, because you feel like you're in a better financial position and you don't miss a lot of those things. And you know what? You might realize you do miss something and bring it back, right? Like, so this is sort of like zero-based budgeting. Like, cut it all, figure out what you're miserable without, and bring it back if you're, that unhappy without it.
Yeah, that's great advice. Guys, thank you so much for coming on the show. This has been a really good conversation. So many good pieces of advice, and I love hearing your perspective on stuff. So again, appreciate you taking some time to jump on with me.
Thanks for having us, Ben. This was fun.
Thanks so much, Ben. We really appreciate it.
So that was some great advice we had there from both of them towards the end of the conversation. I really like Mike's point about not hesitating and easing into making those major changes to play catch up. It's such a great thought to have that you need to make some dramatic changes if you really want to change your direction and you've waited until later in life. Like Maggie said, it's not too late to do something. The same principles apply, but you do have some catch up to do. So making some more dramatic changes with your budget and with your investments and savings, you have to really look at it from that perspective if you want to make up that lost time. So again, thanks to both of them for jumping on the show. It was a great conversation. Be sure to listen to their show. Again, it's Friends on Fire. You can find it on all the different streaming services. I'll put a link in the show notes. And thank you for listening to the show today. I really hope you got something out of it. And I will talk to you again next week. Take care. To read more about my story, be sure to follow me at FiAfter40 on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. You can also subscribe to receive updates whenever new content goes up at FiAfter40.com. Also, be sure to subscribe to the podcast and leave a rating and review. It makes a big difference. Thanks for listening.